and welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our program's mission is to nourish the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Our forums occur on most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue. For more information, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today, I am happy to introduce our presenter, Angela Smith. She is a member of our church and immediate past president of our congregation. She's a freelance writer and the executive director emeritus of the Writers League of Texas. Her book on women drummers is the basis for a feature-length documentary that she's going to be discussing today, and we're going to get to see a clip of it too. The documentary will be released at some point in 2017. She is currently serving as technical consultant for that film. Former reporter for the Associated Press, she is also a musician who plays cello, piano, and steel drum. Let's give a warm welcome to Angela Smith.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to share with you some not so well-known music history. Some of you know a few years ago I started playing the steel drum. I'd always been fascinated with that instrument, and when I discovered it was the only acoustic musical instrument invented in the 20th century, and most of the creators were still alive, I decided to write a book about it. I made several trips to Trinidad and did extensive hands-on research into carnival revelry and the fun-loving antics of steel drum musicians. And while doing my research, I also made friends with numerous percussionists in this country, mostly men and very, very few women. This disparity between the sexes especially hit home with me since I was a white woman in my 60s playing an instrument primarily and traditionally played by young black men. My book, Steel Drums and Steel Bands, A History, was published in 2012 and became a #1 bestseller in Caribbean history. A few months later, my editor at Rowman and Littlefield, who happens to share my love for all things music, you might call us musical sluts, wrote me an email in which he mentioned the ignored drumming skills of Karen Carpenter. After a little research, I discovered Karen Carpenter wasn't the only female whose drumming skills had been ignored. I did a little informal survey of my friends and asked them to name their favorite female drummer. With the exception of a few who said Sheila E., most responded with blank stares or said, "I don't know any women drummers." So I decided it was time to write another book. I had always wanted to write a book about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I got to do one better, a book about badass lady drummers. In fact, that was actually the working title of the book, Badass Lady Drummers. In gathering information, I had the opportunity to interview over 60 professional women drummers representing more than 8 decades of music. One of the most interesting interviews was with Michelle Joseph, who started out as a male drummer and underwent gender transition and became a woman. She gave me the interesting perspective of one who had seen both sides of the road. As a male, she was named Canada's top country drummer. But as a woman, she was fired from her band and couldn't find any work, even though her skills were the same. I also interviewed pioneer female drummer Viola Smith, who will be celebrating her 104th birthday this year, in fact, next month. Viola is still going strong and is not only still comfortable with a pair of drumsticks in her hands, but also working as a bookkeeper in one of Orange County, California's largest craft stores. She's 104. She was considered the female Gene Krupa of her time and sent shockwaves through the music community in 1942 when she wrote an editorial in Downbeat magazine saying hep women could play in any jam session and hold their own. She's as hep today as she was when she wrote that editorial almost 75 years ago. Pauline Brady of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm and Helen Coe of the Prairie View Coeds also earned places on my Pioneer Hall of Fame. The bands they played with were all black bands. And they were so good, many white women tried to pass for black so they could be part of those groups. They often were arrested and put in southern jails along with light-skinned black women who were accused of being white women trying to pass for black. Dottie Dodgen was another pioneer. She's in her 90s and still plays a regular gig at a club on Pebble Beach. She was with Benny Goodman's band until one night she got more applause than he did. She was fired the next morning. And of course, we can't forget Karen Carpenter, who's been the inspiration for many female drummers today. She was a great singer, but we sometimes forget she was an even better drummer. In fact, Esquire magazine once had a reader's poll in which she came in #1 over Led Zeppelin's John Bonham. Bonham was pretty bitter about it and went around telling everyone Karen Carpenter wouldn't last 10 minutes in a Led Zeppelin number. But Buddy Rich, who was one of the greatest drummers of all time, when he met Karen, told her, "Karen Carpenter, do you know you're one of my favorite drummers?" Some speculate that when she was forced to step away from the drums and focus on her singing, that started her problems with anorexia. Those who knew her said that the drums were her security blanket, and she'd always considered herself a drummer who sang, not a singer who played the drums. Some speculate she might still be alive today if she hadn't been forced to give up her seat behind her drum set. Another amazing woman I got to interview was Dame Evelyn Glennie, the fabulous multi-talented drummer who was the first to make it as a female solo percussionist, and whose performance was a highlight of the opening ceremony of the London Olympics. I discovered her original ambition was to be a hairdresser. What makes her story all the more incredible is that she's managed to succeed despite the fact that she's deaf. The great drummer Sheila E. also didn't start out wanting to be a drummer. She wanted to be the first female on the moon and then an Olympic track star, and she actually trained for the Olympics. Fortunately, she discovered her true calling was music. She's not only a talented drummer, she's also an astute businesswoman and philanthropist. Her Elevate Hope Foundation promotes the use of music to help abused and abandoned children. The foundation's work for her is very personal, since she was abused herself as a child by a babysitter. The great blues musician Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton also had a fascinating story. She was one of the first to combine her vocal and drumming skills. According to one account, her musical career started when she helped a music producer move a piano up several flights of stairs. He figured if she was that strong, he would give her a chance to prove she had the vocal and drumming abilities to match. I also found it intriguing that some of the wildest drummers of the 60s and 70s are now extremely conservative in their views. Take, for example, Mo Tucker of the Velvet Underground. She's now an active and outspoken participant in the Tea Party movement and a staunch defender of that candidate. I can't even mention his name. Paloma Romero, known as Palmolive, who played with the Slits, Sid Vicious, The Clash, Sex Pistols, Buzzcocks, and other top bands in London's early punk scene, is now a born-again Christian who devotes most of her time to church work. The recurring theme I found in all my interviews was that women still have a long way to go before being recognized as equals to their male drumming peers. In fact, the first named drummer in history was a woman. Lipashaw, who was the granddaughter of a Sumerian king, there's an artifact that bears her name that dates back to 2380 BC. In pre-biblical times, women were considered holy, magical beings because of their ability to give birth. And in most ancient cultures, the drum was considered a feminine object. And the beat of the drum was representative of the heartbeat of Mother Earth. The drum then was a major symbol of sexuality and fertility. In the Middle Ages, drumming became associated with pagan practice, and the church condemned it, calling drums instruments of an insane cult. The church felt that anything associated with melody, rhythm, and meter was related to heathenism. Women were especially enjoined from playing instruments because it was considered neither good nor becoming. The only women who could participate in any church musical activity were asexual virgins who were allowed to sing in choirs. Fortunately, in the 12th century, music had its outlaws, including Hildegard of Bingen and St. Teresa of Avila. Both did their best to elevate music and the use of instruments, including the drum, as appropriate and suitable for worship. Then, over a period of several hundred years, the expansion of military power over Europe and Asia would give rise to a patriarchal society, and the woman drummer and women musicians in general were pretty much silenced. The attitude of it not being decent for women to play instruments, especially drums, hung on for several hundred years. It wasn't until all-female bands began to form at the end of the 18th century that women began to step outside the bounds. Of course, it was still more acceptable for a woman to play the piano or sing than it was to play any instrument. In the 1800s, women began taking part in musical activities, but mostly studying piano and voice to provide entertainment in the home and to improve their prospects for marriage. Being a serious musician for a female was a no-no. The role of the woman was primarily domestic and to serve as a muse for the male artist. Until late in the century, orchestras were all male clubs, and the only instrument considered suitable for a woman was the harp, because the movements required to play it were graceful and womanly. It wasn't until the late 1800s that women started to come out of hiding and publicly show off their musical chops. Minstrel shows with all-female cast and vaudeville gave them opportunities they had never had before. Prior to that, during the Civil War, several girls cut their hair short and dressed up in male garb to disguise themselves as boys so they could be drummer boys in the Confederate and Union armies. Between 1880 and 1918, status of women began to change with the suffrage movement and birth control. In the ragtime era of the early 1900s, women were working as musicians in family bands or as side performers in circuses, carnivals, and tent shows. A few all-female orchestras were started in the Victorian era, but they never gained much respect or attention. The minstrel show also became popular, and all-female minstrel shows began to form. The great blues singers Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith started their careers as minstrel performers. Vaudeville also gave women musicians a chance to perform. It also gave them a great living wage. In 1919, the average factory worker earned less than $1,300 a year. Vaudeville performers working for 42 weeks a year could earn over $3,000 a year. But in selecting those all-girl bands for vaudeville acts, the attractiveness of the individual members was much more important than their musical abilities. The women's movement of that time had begun as an attempt to liberate the sexuality of women and ended up with women being viewed by men as sexual objects. To be socially acceptable and to win and keep a husband, a woman had to look sexy, free, and available. With the coming of the jazz age in the 1920s, the women known as flappers began to exercise a new freedom. They started driving motor cars, smoking in public, and holding men's hands without wearing gloves. All female bands started forming, and they used women drummers. But the musical form called jazz wasn't universally accepted. Some found it extremely objectionable and thought it spelled a disaster for the future of American music. Even Thomas Edison, the inventor of the phonograph, one of the major reasons that jazz had become so popular, didn't care for the musical form and claimed he played jazz records backwards because they sounded better that way. Opponents of jazz blamed it for just about everything, including the death of a celebrated British conductor who collapsed during a visit to Coney Island. Newspapers blamed the music of a jazz band playing on the boardwalk with his untimely death. Women were especially susceptible to the evils of this new music. The Indiana Vigilance Association reported the downfall of 1,000 girls could be traced directly to the pernicious influence of jazz music. In Cincinnati, the Salvation Army obtained an order to stop construction of a theater next to a home for expectant mothers on the ground that the enforced proximity of the theater would implant dangerous jazz emotions in helpless infants. Mrs. Max Obendorfer, the chairman of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, associated the music with voodoo and barbarian practice. But for all the criticism, jazz found a place in the 1920s and 30s, and a few women dared to break the swing barrier, most of them as canaries and femmes on the 88s, the names given to singers and pianists. Women drummers were still pretty much a rarity. And for women musicians, especially in the all-girl orchestras, the main thing was still looks, which is not a surprise since most of these groups were organized by men. Phil Spitowny, who started the Hour of Charm Orchestra, auditioned 1,500 women before he found 20 with suitable glamour for his group. And one of those 15 glamorous women happens to be a member of this church, Marilyn Wilson, who played the flute with that group. Despite the quality of their music, all-girl bands were not taken very seriously. Take, for example, Ina Ray and her Melodiers and Ada Leonard's All-American Girl Orchestra. Both of these women leaders had no musical experience, but they could convey sex with their low-cut strapless gowns and energetic movement. As they glided around the stage waving their batons, there was always the chance of a wardrobe malfunction, which audiences found as enticing as the music itself. World War II changed everything because all the men were drafted and women had to fill their slots, including in music. The war opened doors for women musicians like never before, and a lot of that was thanks to the editorial written by Viola Smith, who stood up for women and argued that women had as much stamina and talent as men and deserved to become permanent fixtures on the musical scene, not just temporary wartime substitutes. That editorial opened a floodgate of letters to the editor. William Perry of Stockton, California wrote, "I'll tell you right now that I don't like girl musicians. Girls should leave this kind of business to persons who know what it's all about and I mean men. Ann Hootie of Fredonia, New York, responding to Perry's comments, wrote, "I am a girl musician, and I'm sorry, but I'll have to say that most men musicians aren't as terrific as you think. I've heard girls play, and brothers, some of them give out with the righteous jive." Surprisingly, the sides taken in this debate didn't always take gender lines. For example, one woman from Cincinnati, Ohio, wrote, "Through no fault of my own, I happen to be a girl. And I definitely agree with William Perry that girls do not make good swing musicians. When it comes to playing good music, girls, how about leaving it to the boys? We ought to be proud to be able to dance to such bands as Tommy Dorsey and Count Basie. Our place is listening and dancing to music, not sitting in with a band and blowing our brains out." And a man from Yuma, Arizona had this response: "Who is William Perry to state dogmatically that girl musicians are inept? I have run across girl musicians who could blow some men off the stand." After the war ended, women were asked to bow out gracefully and let the men have the paying gigs because they needed to support their families. No consideration was given to women who had families to support. If a woman refused to pack up her instrument and take her rightful place in the home, she was called unpatriotic. There was one exception to this. The Hormel Company, the company that made Spam, decided to form an all-girl drum and bugle corps made up entirely of returning women vets. They were known as the Spamettes and became quite a hit. They were the first all-female group to compete in the American Legion National Drum and Bugle Corps competition in New York City in 1947. That was after 5 weeks of rehearsal in which they ran through 500 pairs of nylon stockings. They came in 13th, and as one band member said, failed to bring home the bacon. But the crowds loved them, and they began touring across the country in a caravan of 35 white Chevrolets, performing and selling Spam and other Hormel meat products. They disbanded in 1953. Women musicians took another step backward with the beginning of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The nuclear family, with its father knows best mentality, came into vogue, and marriage, home, and children became all important. How better to ensure domestic security and protect the American way of life from a communist takeover? But some women didn't buy it. Given the choice between marriage and music, here's what one gal had to say. "The guy wanted to marry me. He said, 'It's me or the horn.' I said, 'Well, it ain't you, babe.'" Rock and roll brought more changes to the musical world, but women playing drums were still seen as a gimmick, and bands that used them had to defend their reasons for doing so. And over the next decades, while women began to gain prominence as singers and songwriters, when it came to playing instruments, especially the drums, they were rarely seen or heard. Music genres have also played their role. If women drummers are still the exception to the rule in the pop music world, they are even more so in the realm of country music. For that matter, even the use of drums is fairly new to this idiom. Drums were scorned by early country musicians as being too loud and not pure. At the Grand Ole Opry, drums were expressly forbidden until Bob Wills defied the ban on December 30th, 1944, with his drummer daring to bring his entire drum set on stage. Grand Ole Opry management was not amused. After the performance, Opry bosses reaffirmed their ban, pronouncing no drum sets would be allowed on stage. In 1954, country singer Carl Smith hired the Nashville big band drummer Buddy Harmon to play for a performance. Opry management relaxed the rules to allow the drummer to play a snare drum with brushes. The only condition was that he play behind a curtain and not be visible to the audience. After that performance, the Opry band drums again. As rockabilly started to emerge, more country drummers started adding drums to their bands. And in 1973, the Grand Ole Opry finally lifted their ban against full drum sets on stage. The story of women in country music in both song and on stage is as interesting a tale as that of the drum in this genre. While women have sung and played country music as long as it's been around, they've been subjected to an underlying male bias. As one country music historian wrote, men could be good-hearted but might be given to drinking, cheating, fighting, lying, and other questionable behaviors. They were free to be full three-dimensional figures with a realistic spectrum of human emotions. Women, on the other hand, were just good-hearted or they were cruel, but never a combination of both. A dramatic change has occurred in the generations between the Carter family, Sarah and Maybelle Carter, who reigned as country music's first ladies, and the country superstars Dixie Chicks, who expound on political issues of the day. The Carter family women songs defined women as lovers, wives, and widows, stressing the accepted ideas of family and gender. When Sarah Carter was divorced, it was kept under wraps because it wasn't seemly for a God-fearing woman, especially one in the public eye, to be a divorcee. It wasn't until Patsy Cline came along that country women came out of hiding as sexy and confident individuals, allowed to be brash, intelligent, complicated, and as flawed as their male counterparts. Blues music was also late to the game. Drums weren't added to bands until the late 30s and 40s, and early blues instrumentalists were overwhelmingly male. Hardcore punk rock was also pretty much dominated by males until the Riot Girls movement of the 1990s. The underground feminist punk rock movement played a key role in changing the musical landscape. Like the Rock for Choice movement, Riot Girl formed in response to the 1990s bombing of abortion clinics by fringe elements of pro-life groups. The subculture Riot Girl movement saw the rise of numerous bands such as Bikini Kill, Bratmobile, Huggy Bear, and Team Dresch, addressing in their music issues such as rape, domestic abuse, sexuality, racism, patriarchy, and female empowerment. Why are women drummers still overlooked? A lot of it has to do with numbers. People are just not used to seeing a woman sitting behind a drum kit. It's estimated there are 100 male drummers to each female. That's why when lists of top drummers come out, women are rarely on those lists. When Rolling Stone magazine asked its readers in 2011 to name the top 100 drummers of all time, not one woman appeared on the list. And I just saw a poll in Modern Drummer magazine a few weeks ago, and again, not one woman was on the list. The association of gender with instruments also has something to do with it. The drum is considered the most male of instruments. Band directors and parents have often steered girls from playing drums for the more feminine and ladylike instruments such as the flute and violin. Women have always been discouraged from pursuing activities perceived as primitive, masculine, or aggressive because it is so physical. A lot of women think women don't have the strength and dexterity to be great drummers. Think of how many women drummers have heard the comment, "You hit pretty good for a girl." Helen Stupinski, former drummer with the New York band Stephonics, said, "To most of us, it is baffling that a woman would want to play drums in the first place. The image of a drummer is of a geeky bloke in shorts with arms like a weightlifter. A girly girl would not want to play the drums." I also heard this story countless times of a female walking into a music store to pick up something for a drum kit, and the salesperson immediately assuming she was there to pick up something for her boyfriend or treating her as if she were trespassing on male territory. Also, some women have found it hard to find work with male bands, especially touring bands, because they find having a woman around awkward. She might report incidents of indiscriminate behavior to their girlfriends and wives back home. Also, too many times, women drummers are considered cool because they're sexy, not because of their talent and skills. As for the future of women drummers, I do see some hope. The increase in the number of visible drummers has led more girls to pursue interest in that area. More women are studying percussion. The rise of rock and roll camps for girls has encouraged girls to take up drumsticks. Big-name artists such as Beyonce, Prince, and Santana have also been instrumental by using women drummers in their bands. And female drummers who have already made a name for themselves, Sheila E., Cindy Blackman, Meg White, Mo Tucker, and the list is growing, have all had a big influence. Kim Thompson, who played with Beyonce, she's also was a drummer in Fred Armisen's band on Seth Meyers' late night TV show. There's also more media attention being given to women drummers, thanks to publications such as Tom Tam magazine, which is a publication devoted exclusively to women drummers, and internet visibility via YouTube and social media outlets. Even a cartoon has had some influence. Remember Josie and the Pussycats and Melody, the quintessential queen of all drummers? Sadly, the woman drummer is still an object of constant scrutiny and has to prove herself not only on skills, but also on looks. Whenever Led Zeppelin played, whoever said, "The drummer is really ugly." But each generation of women drummers is building on the gains of the previous, and perhaps one day drum message boards will be free of wisecracks about drum kits not fitting in kitchens. I know I'm trying to do my part to celebrate these nasty women whenever I can. For all the progress they've made over more than a century, and especially over the last 3 decades, women drummers are still fighting for deserved recognition. In the ever-changing world of popular music, where females often dominate as vocalists, women drummers are still considered a novelty. Despite the many contributions they've made to music and their proven ability to match the chops of their male counterparts, the female drummer is still too often the victim of sexism in the music industry. To paraphrase one female drummer, in the corporate world, employers can be legally forced to hire the most qualified. Not so in music, where personal preference still rules. To give you an idea of how far women drummers have come, here's a quote from Stephanie Eulenberg of Kid Rock. "The only thing that pisses me off is when you hear guys say, 'You're the best girl drummer I've ever seen.' What was that supposed to mean? But you'll never not have that. No matter what, they're always going to say that. And it's not as bad as it used to be. I only hear it like once a week now." And if you'd like to learn more about this fascinating subject, may I recommend a wonderful book on this subject. I'm now going to show you the sizzle, which is the promotional reel for the documentary that's being made based on this book. Are we ready?
It started with a whisper, and that was when I kissed her, and then she made my lips hurt. I could hear the chit-chat, take me to your love shack. Mama's always got a backtrack.
Who said it was a male instrument? It's not. I just happen to be a woman playing drums and percussion, and I'm good.
Drumming has traditionally been thought of as a masculine thing to do. Women have always been discouraged from doing anything that's masculine or primitive or aggressive. And playing the drum is all those things.
I'd like you to meet our very charming little drummer, Viola Smith.
In the early days, girl drummers didn't even think of it, nor did the public think of accepting them. It was just not to be done.
If she hadn't laid the groundwork for everyone else, it's sad to think of what the world would be like today.
The drum was always this thing that stood out for me. And so from those moments on, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that that's what I had to do.
For me, there really was no moment that I realized I wanted to be a musician. It was kind of something that I've always done since I can remember.
I hated it, you know, from the get-go. I was like, there's no such thing as girl drummers. For many years, I didn't like it. My heart wasn't into it. I grew to love it.
It's almost like ladies playing rugby. They do. And I think the drums is that kind of stigma as well. You know, it's more of a man's instrument. And I think, you know, most of the female drummers I've seen are really good and just as good as the guys.
Whatever you do, you got to have that outlet. Everyone needs to have an outlet like that. Anyone who doesn't have a sort of artistic release in life, I feel that they're missing out, for sure.
I want women to be recognized as credible musicians. That's what it's all about.
Ready for some question and answers? Okay. We have a question from John Franks.
A question and observation. One is that I don't think Hart ever had any women drummers. It's kind of surprising to me. And the other thing is the Japanese taiko groups, the women drummers, and that seem to be much more accepted.
They are, definitely. In fact, there are drumming groups all over the world where women have been banned from drumming, and they're now coming out, especially in South America. There are several groups, drumming groups, that are coming out now that were prohibited from drumming.
Yeah, I'm Dan Wilson, and I've been a drummer for the past 70 years. And I'm currently playing in a brass band called the Austin Brass Band, and it's patterned after the brass bands of the United Kingdom, England, Wales. And I am the drummer, and we need more drummers. If there are any women or men who have been wanting to get back into drumming, see me, please. But one more observation. In this brass band 2 years ago, I was the drummer from forever, and there were two young women who joined me, and I heard them during a break talking to each other, and they were mentioning their own ages. And I thought, ye gods, I'm 3 times as old as this one and 4 times as old as that one. And they were really great drummers. Unfortunately, they have.
Are they still drumming?
Yeah, I think they're still drumming, but being, I think, 18 and 25 at the time, they have gone other directions. Yeah. So thank you.
That's also an indication that younger people are getting more interested, or younger females are getting interested.
Angela, when did you start drumming, and how long have you been drumming?
A little over 10 years ago, I started. I played the piano and the cello, but I'd always wanted to play the steel drum. So that was my first introduction to the percussion community, and I've loved it.
Yes, I'm curious as to why Karen had to give up the drums. I mean, it seems that she was such a big star that she should have been able to refuse. Was she just under that much influence?
She was under that much influence. Her family really wanted her to be the singer. And the management who took over their act all felt that she needed to be promoting her singing rather than her drumming. Because everybody loved her as a singer.
So fabulous, Angela. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And in the process of this, you've talked about the sexism of men a great deal. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit more about the the roots of that sexism, and why you think, the good news is, of course, we've gotten better than that. But the bad news is it still lingers on in many terrible ways. Can you talk about how music and your perseverance and what insights you've developed about that kind of sexism and where it comes from and how
Well, the sexism started with the church.
Okay, go ahead.
Unfortunately, that's where it started. The Catholic Church associated any kind of music with paganism and heathenism, and especially the involvement of women in the church. Until then, women had been the musicians. Women had been the drummers. They were considered, in ancient times, they were considered holy, magical beings because they were able to give birth, and the drum was considered a symbol of fertility and sexuality. And then when the church came along, they said no, and so and then women were, and then also the rise of this military influence in Europe and Asia gave rise to this patriarchal society, which also silenced women. And unfortunately, today we're still fighting it.
Pat Beulah, would you talk a little bit about drumming in the Native American communities?
Okay, well, in the Native American communities, it's sort of an interesting dichotomy because there are some Indian tribes that allow women to be the drummers, and there are other Indian tribes that do not allow women to be drummers. In the ancient times, again, the women were the drummers.
I would love to know about the documentary, when it's coming out, or any information you can give us about that.
About what?
The documentary?
Oh, it's scheduled for release in May of 2017. It's being now shopped out to to different film festivals.
And what's that journey been like, filming the documentary? I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, it's been very exciting to be involved with the documentary. After I'd written this book, the producer happened to contact my publisher because they saw the book and decided I had already done all their research. So they asked the publisher if they could reach me, and they did. And of course, I was very excited about it. And so now I'm working as technical assistant on the film. And it's just been a wonderful experience. It's like unlike anything I ever thought I'd be doing. So,
do you know what kind of venues it'll be shown at?
They're going to be showing it at different film festivals. So that's what they're shopping in out now too. So.
Hi, Angela. I was wondering, it seems that most female drummers had a lot of discouragement early on, and I'm wondering, did most of them come from other instruments?
Informally, in fact, most women of my era who started out with other instruments have stayed with those other instruments. And I found very few women who changed instruments. I think most women drummers today, if they start out as women drummers, then they stay as women drummers. But I know of very few instances where women took up drumming later. There is in the Northeast. They now have this. It's similar to the rock and roll camps for girls, and these are rock and roll camps for over 50. Women over 50, and I do know some women who are taking part in those groups and who have taken up drums as a result of that. But most of them, I find that most drummers who take up drumming later in life have no other musical experience.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I note, though, that percussion doesn't have quite the range that your steel guitar has. What is the? Would you mind describing some of the differences between a steel guitar that has notes and percussion, which doesn't seem to me to
there are
have
actually
any notes?
Several percussion instruments that are melodic instruments. The marimba, the celeste, there are numerous percussion instruments. In fact, the piano is actually a percussion instrument. So there are lots of percussion instruments that have a range of notes.
Hey, Angela, this is great. I can hardly wait till the movie comes out. I have 3 questions. One, did you get to travel to meet any of these drummers?
Yes,
in the
I have
filming?
traveled extensively. In fact, we have another shooting. I was in New York a few weeks ago for a shooting. I've been in Los Angeles for a shooting, and we're going to Nashville next. So.
Ooh, wow. The second one is, so there's a lot of women touring bands or individual women musicians that tour. Are you finding more of them are willing to hire female drummers? So is there an increase in female drummers hired professionally by women musicians or not? Or you don't know?
There are women groups that hire women drummers and women percussionists. For instance, in fact, we have a group here in town, KP and the Boom Booms, and and they have a wonderful percussionist, Carolyn Trowbridge, who tours with them. So,
well, I guess that's great. I'm very hopeful, and I guess there's a women's percussionist group here in town, the Ginger Babes or something like that. Yeah, I mean they're awesome. So
yeah.
It's really great to hear about more.
And there are all sorts of drumming circles that are forming, and so there are more and more women who are becoming interested in drumming and percussion. After being discouraged all these years by parents and band directors who said, "Oh no, you don't want to play the drums, play the violin, play the flute."
Can you tell us more about your group that I've seen perform at the book festival?
Yes.
And I'd like to hear more about that. You guys have performed here and at the book festival, and I've been talking it up, and a lot of people don't seem to know about your steel band group.
This is the Inside Out Steel Band, and it's a community group that was started by C.J. Mingy, who also started. There are over 15 steel bands now in schools in Austin, and he started all those bands. But our community group is made up of we have anywhere from 20 to 30 participants in that group. And we're going to be playing at the Texas Book Festival at 4 o'clock on November 6th. So if you're at the Texas Book Festival, come out and hear us play. But also, if anybody would like to join our community steel band, and most of the musicians in that group they don't read music. They've never had any music lessons in their life. They never were in a band or orchestra. But CJ's a great teacher, and he'll teach you how to do it. And so it's really, really fun. And we have a beginners group that meets on Tuesday nights, and the studio is off Voltorf, but you can check out our website. It's Inside Out Steel Band.
I think you also have a camp in the summertime
Yes,
for
we
kids.
do. We have an Inside Out Steel Band camp, and I help out with that. It's at McCallum High School, and we have a group for middle schoolers and then a group for high school students. And it's a week-long camp, and it's just really, really fun.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left. If there's more questions, or Angela, if you have more information you want to share.
I'm curious how many of you are familiar with women drummers? And do you all have any perspective on why women drummers aren't that acknowledged or accepted or? That's interesting, yeah.
I'm sorry. It's the same way in the arts that you have in the music industry, which is an art in itself, but you have the arts, watercolor, oil painting, and authors. For some reason, women have been overlooked. I don't want to say discriminated against, but they have been overlooked or shoved into a corner someplace. Although they can be fantastic writers, fantastic musicians, and artists. There's a reason I'm looking for you for the reason.
It's true. It's true. No, the sexism has abounded in the arts, all the arts. In fact, women have often been their own worst enemy. Clara Schumann, who was a great American woman composer and great woman musician, gave it up at the age of 30 saying, I don't need to be doing this, I'm a woman.
Yes, I was wondering, country and western bands with female drummers, can you name some? Because I don't recall seeing any.
I have a whole chapter in my book about country women drummers. It's called Honky Tonk Angels, the chapter. Earlene Mandrell, you know the Mandrell sisters? She was one of the first country women drummers. Nancy Given Prout, Lisa Romeo, Lisa Pankratz, Jen Yates, Karen Biller, she's actually a drummer here in Austin, and she plays with country bands at the Broken Spoke frequently. Terry Coate, and then Michelle Joseph, the woman I told you about, she started out as a male drummer and then underwent gender transition and became a woman. She was Canada's top country drummer when she was a male. So those are some of the women drummers that I interviewed.
We have a question from Michael Kersey.
Angela, I was wondering what the inspiration for the book was. Were you drumming and then began doing the research, or were you doing the research and then began drumming, or what inspired you to write the book?
Well, first I had written the book about whenever I started playing the steel drum, I discovered it was the only instrument invented in the 20th century, and no one had ever written about it. And most of the creators were still alive because they were teenagers when they created the instrument. So I wrote that, decided I was going to write a book about it. And the book was really successful, and my publisher really wanted me to write another book. And he just happened to mention in one of his emails to me that this was the editor that I was working with at Rowan and Littlefield, the publisher, wrote me an email one day and talked about the ignored drumming skills of Karen Carpenter. He had just seen a video of her and just thought she was just really tremendous and asked me to check it out. And so I thought, that might be a good subject. And then I discovered, I did this little informal poll of my friends and asked them to name their favorite female drummer, and nobody knew anybody except for Sheila E. And so I decided maybe that was subject for another book. So that was my inspiration.
My name is Ed Underhill. Just sort of in response to your question is like, why is this the case? Maybe the idea of vocation, the Protestant idea of calling, God calls you to be something or other, how that falls out differently with respect to women than to men. It's a sort of a theological notion. Yeah, thank you.
This is Glenn Williams again. I love the Mandrell Sister TV show. What happened to Earlene Mandrell? Did she retire? Is
she retired, but she's still around.
Okay.
And I talked to her.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I now remember she was prominently displayed on some of the TV shows as drumming. It's something I'd slipped my mind.
She was the first female to make it as a country drummer.
I don't have a question as much of a comment. You're asking about why this might be the case. I started as a percussionist in my experience in band in high school, and I had I've always sang, but I didn't have much experience besides that. And I will say, I mean, they don't have a lot of women drummers, right? But they'll have them like doing tambourine or kind of the fluffy sort of thing. Yeah, so I got put on cymbals my first year because I didn't know anything, right? And, as it turned out, I couldn't keep the beat. I couldn't, keep up the pace of some of the, I don't even remember what they're called. Not the snare drums, would they have like 4 of them? I couldn't go that fast. But I don't think there was a lot of boys that did it, and they were very exceptional at it. And it was like me and one other female cymbal player, and I don't feel like we were ever got the same sort of grooming that the guys did. So that's my limiting.
Did anyone ever try to discourage you? Did a band director or a parent discourage you from playing?
No, but I don't feel. I was more neglected than discouraged, I would say. Yeah, I don't feel like it was. Well, it was. Yeah, they just, we weren't groomed for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we were well, yeah. I was a first year, and then the other girl I think was too, and they just didn't take us so seriously, generally speaking.
So, Angela, even after women became accepted, and it sounds like they were accepted begrudgingly at first, and maybe still are in some ways.
Still not. Some are still not.
How are they continued to be discriminated against? Are, for example, they pay the same as men drummers, or paid less, or what? Is there discrimination that way? What other ways?
Again, it's personal preference. It's not like being in the corporate world or being where you have a salary scale. And most women, I would say, are probably paid less than the men.
Are there other ways you can think of that this discrimination shows itself?
Well, discrimination is just, sometimes it's just blatant sexism. For instance, most of the websites devoted to women drummers are strictly sex sites. They're not celebrating the talent and skills of these women. They're just looking upon the woman drummer as a sex object. And that's pretty blatant. In fact, the woman who started, Mindy Abowitz, who started Tom Tom magazine, said she started it specifically for that reason, because whenever she went on the internet and looked up websites that had to do with women drummers, the majority of them were sexist websites.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the presentation, but we have time for just a few more closing comments, if you have any, Angela.
I want you all to go out and promote women drummers. And I also happen to have copies of my book, if any of you are interested in reading more about this subject.
All right, thank you very much, Angela. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.